All right. Today we are diving into the wide world of HTML and CSS. And HTML and CSS are important because these are the languages of the browser, which means in a lot of ways they're the languages of the web. And we might not think of HTML as a language, but it is. It stands for hypertext markup language, and the T there in hypertext is also capitalized. And a markup language is one where we call it declarative. I'm not adding if and else statements and conditional logic. I'm telling the browser exactly what I want it to display, and the browser kind of renders it. And CSS came along later, and CSS stands for cascading style sheets, which is a little bit of a confusing term, but we'll talk about it later. Um, and we'll learn more about these in a bit, but in essence, HTML's job is content and structure of a page, and CSS's job is layout and style of a page. And if you think about it as, um, you know, how do you take what used to maybe be a magazine, like maybe a print magazine, and how do I display it on the web? And if we look here at this Amazon.com site, we see there's so much going on here. We have this sort of top bar section here. And inside that, and forgive my terrible drawing, but we can see that this is broken down into a number of little boxes inside another row. We see that there's a search bar. We see that there's this sort of carousel section. And we see that we have these sort of like category boxes for different items, right? Where we have a title, we have some images, and the image itself has sort of a subheading. And then we have a link down here. And everything is just boxes within boxes within boxes. So, before the internet, we wouldn't quite see something like this, but if we opened up a newspaper, we would see ads. And in fact, if we go to, I don't know, let's go to Entertainment Weekly. If we go to Entertainment Weekly, before the internet, this was a print periodical, right? And the question of how do you lay out text so it looks nice? How do you deal with different font sizes, right? And we have one kind of font here, and then our author of the article has a different one here. And basically, how do I organize this information? This has been, sort of a problem for the world of graphic design and printed type for really for centuries. And so HTML and CSS really came about to tackle this question of how do I do this for displaying documents on the web? Because HTML and CSS, really HTML came from academia originally and was really originally designed for displaying text documents. And Wikipedia, the encyclopedia of the internet, is a great example of sort of the original vision for HTML was the sharing of text-based information, right, along with some images. And as the web just grew and became kind of amazing, um, it's not just about displaying text-based information. There's animations, there's whole applications in there, right? And so something like Google Maps, while HTML and CSS are used for this kind of interactivity, um, and all the kind of data that's happening here, and we're seeing me scroll around Chicago, and let's search for, I don't know, museums. JavaScript comes into play here as well. And so at this point, we're not really looking at a static document of just text. We're looking at a real program written in JavaScript, right? That just happens to be running in the browser. And we still have HTML and CSS, right? It's used to display this text here. It's probably even used over here for some of this stuff, but it's really in the service of an application. So today we're just going to start with the fundamentals of HTML and CSS to learn how these key building blocks work. Before we get too deep into that, I do want to talk a little bit about how the internet works. And we'll use Amazon.com as an example. We're also going to kind of go through the anatomy of a URL. Then we'll do a pretty deep dive into HTML, both the high-level structure of an HTML document, as well as all the different HTML elements and tags. And then in part two, we'll look at CSS, cascading style sheets, and we'll see different ways of using it. We'll see sort of how CSS prioritizes what styles get applied where, and we'll learn about the CSS box model. So I just want to pause and check in and see if folks have any questions before we dive in. Okay, awesome. So I've talked a little bit about HTML and CSS, but let me talk a little bit about how the internet works. And we can see here, like I'm on the site Amazon.com, and maybe I want to search for a dishwasher. And as I'm typing, I'm getting these search results come up. And if I click on something, I go to a search results page. But so what's happening here is the browser is actually making requests over the internet to a server for Amazon in the cloud as I type. And in fact, if we open up, they call it the network tab, we can see this happen live and direct. And it's a little hard to see, but we'll see that every time, not even just when I type, but every time I click, the browser is sending some sort of request over the network, and it's getting data back from Amazon. And then if I hit enter, I run my search, and we get all this data back, right? And so somewhere on Amazon server, it's stored images of all these dishwasher pod brands and their names and their descriptions and all of that good stuff. So what's happening is, and we're going to go with our boxes within boxes here. You know, maybe I'm doing this on my computer. Or maybe I'm doing it on my phone. And I am on the Amazon website, right? And I'm searching for dishwasher pods. And these devices are what we call the client. And this is just a fancy word for a computer, whether it's a phone or a laptop or a Raspberry Pi or anything else, that's requesting information over the internet. And these days we have the cloud, which is really just sort of like a fancy term for a giant data center, though we'll learn more about what the cloud actually is later. And somewhere in the cloud, we have either a real computer or a virtual computer. And when I search for dishwasher pods, it goes to this computer in the cloud. And traditionally, we call this computer a server. And the server's job is to serve a request from the client. Right? So as a client, and let's see if we can't make this a bit bigger just so it's more readable. my browser is making a request. We'll learn more about the different kinds of requests later. But the most common kind is called a GET request. And, maybe I'm making this up, but I'm sending to the server a request to search for dishwasher pods, where this URL kind of has all the information the server needs, um, both for the network to find the right server and then to pass on the information that I'm looking for. And maybe someone else is doing this same search from their phone. And again, my apologies here for the sort of rough squigglies. And maybe they're searching for eco-friendly dishwasher pods. And this server is a computer running a program, and later in Django, we'll learn how to build this, but you can do it in a lot of different ways. That is meant to handle these different requests coming in over the internet. And the server probably has to talk to a database. It probably doesn't have all of those images of dishwasher pods or anything like that. And we'll actually start to learn more about databases soon. And so the server might have to talk to the database to get information about dishwasher pods. And the database is, in fact, running on another computer in the cloud. And the database will send some information back to the server. And then the server can send that information back to the client. And these days, that's normally done where when this message from the server, this response is sent over the internet, it uses what's called JSON or JavaScript object notation. And I'm going to simplify this a bit. Let's just pretend it's sending the image over. It's actually probably sending a URL that's a link to where the image lives on another server. And this is sent back to my computer. And now my computer can display this information in the browser. And a similar process happens for, say, the phone. And again, I apologize that my drawings have gotten a little terrible here. Let's redraw that one. We'll do a nice big arc. So this is happening all the time when you're on a website, because it's not just dishwasher pods where my browser is talking to a server. Amazon is also tracking every single thing that I do. And this network tab shows you sort of the history of this communication going back and forth between a client and the server. And as we'll note, even if I click in here, that sends some sort of request. And then if I click on a dishwasher pod, we'll see another request get sent in just a minute if it will load up for me. And interestingly, it looked like something went wrong, which is a bit surprising. That normally does not happen. And it looks like, I wonder if Amazon's actually having an issue, though. That's pretty rare. But I think you all get the idea where, um, you know, almost everything that I'm doing on the internet, the browser is communicating with a server across a network. in order to get more data, right? In order to fetch this information from a server and then display this information that we need. So that's sort of like a high level overview of the internet and the role that the browser plays here, right? Because in this process, I've got my browser running here on my computer or on my phone. And the browser's job is to take my user input when I click on a link or type something in and enter if I submit data in a form, send a request to some server. A server sends back a response, and the response can include JSON data. The response also includes HTML and CSS. And if we take a look here, again, using the network tab in the browser DevTools, if I kind of just refresh this page and we go up and we look at some of the very first requests here, and let me make sure I'm not filtering anything out. And there we go. There's a whole bunch of stuff because modern browsers have all sorts of like caching and kind of tricks that they do for things. But the first thing that we'll see that gets sent back is actually HTML. And we can see here that my browser sent a request to the Wikipedia server for a cat. And the server sent back a whole bunch of HTML, right? This is basically an HTML file or an HTML page. If I scroll all the way up to the top, we can get to the beginning of this. And so the browser actually sends back that whole HTML file that we could write. We're going to learn what this is, what all these different things do, and how we break this down. But I think this is the key thing that I want us to see here is that the server is sending back the HTML page to the browser. And then the browser is fetching additional information. When the browser sees things like this, as it's reading its HTML page, it's fetching CSS. Um, it's fetching images of cats, right? As the browser reads through this giant HTML file and it hits this link tag and it sees it needs to fetch an image file, it makes another request to do that. And somewhere in here was cat on snow. There we go. And the browser talks to a server and requests the image of the cat on the snow, and the server sends it back, and then the browser actually displays it. And we can see somewhere in here is a picture of a cat in the snow. I might have to scroll down a little bit because there's a lot of cat pictures. And I don't know if it's that one, but it's hiding around here somewhere. So let me just pause here and see what questions folks have or what people are curious about before we start diving more into HTML. Arnold, yes, sir.
Sorry, I might have missed it, but how did you access that? Is it just the inspect?
Yeah, great
Yes.
question. It's the inspect or often called browser DevTools. So if you right click and go to inspect, it brings up, this is usually called developer tools or the developer console. By the way, I do recommend you all start using Chrome. It's just sort of the standard for front-end engineering, and its developer tools are incredibly good. I'm a huge fan of open source, but Chrome is just sort of the industry standard. And I don't want to get too deep into this right now. We'll see this elements page more in a little bit that lets us actually kind of navigate through the structure of a web page and see its different parts. In fact, this even lets us interact with a web page and do different things to it. So if I refresh the page, my changes will be gone because it will grab the page again from the server. And then we have what's called the JavaScript console here. where I can run JavaScript. I can in fact interact with my HTML, though this is again getting a little bit ahead of things. We'll learn more about this ID attribute in a little bit, but I can write JavaScript to interact with the HTML documents. And this was sort of like the original use case for JavaScript. And this actually returns me a sort of object representing this particular HTML element in the DOM. We'll learn about the DOM later. Um, Sources we'll learn about later, but you can see here all the different files that get loaded for this web page. This starts to matter more when we get into JavaScript. We don't have to worry about it too much right now. Network is useful. I do recommend looking at it a little bit. We'll spend a lot more time with it later. Performance, memory, application, these others we don't have to worry about right now. Right now, I would just recommend keep the inspector open, keep it on the Elements tab, mainly for today and tomorrow, just to start to get used to it. The other way to open the inspector is if you go to View, down to Developer, and do Developer Tools. That'll open it, and there's a keyboard shortcut for it as well. And there's a couple shortcuts to open different sort of inspector tabs. Alex, yes, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering, so for Wikipedia specifically is a great example. When someone comes in to edit uh info, say about a cat, they're not I know Wikipedia does give the option to actually edit via like HTML, but for the non-technical people that are just typing in a text box, is it is it automatically writing HTML for them and editing the code?
Yeah, that's a great question. That gets a little more complex. I think the key thing you're talking about is what's called an HTML form. I'm not even sure how I edit a page without logging in. Does anyone know where I go if I wanted to edit this page?
I think you have to log in for documentation purposes.
I have to log in. Okay. Yeah, the short answer is I edit the page, and then when I click the submit button or the save button or whatever that button says, it's sending all of the changes I've made to a server. And then the server deals with that, and if Wikipedia is going to use that to update the page, it would be done there. Because if I go back to this diagram here, which I realize is a little sketchy, no pun intended, but if we have an HTML page, if I want to make sure that every person that's going to see a future version of that page sees my changes, it's not enough for me to just change the HTML page in my browser on my computer or here on my phone. I need to actually change the data that lives on the server so that when I edit the cats page, the next time someone goes to look at it, they get the new version, right? So this is, I think, one of the big concepts with the internet is the source of truth is always on the server side or in the database, right? That like my computer's job, the client's job is really just to fetch something from the server. And if we're going to change something, I need to send those changes to the server so they can be saved here so that because the server is the source of truth. The details of like the actual editor user interface and stuff are a little out of scope right now, but does that help answer your question a bit, sort of in the big picture?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Great question. All right. Um, let's see. Any other questions before we sort of keep on rolling? Okay, awesome. Let me go ahead and kind of pull up a guide here that I have. And let's start talking a bit more about an HTML document. So we've talked a bit about what is HTML, how the internet works, and Amazon. We'll get to an anatomy of a URL in just a moment. Let's look at this Amazon page and talk a little bit about the different parts of it. And let's go back to the Amazon homepage because this has a really nice layout. And I'm in fact going to use the inspector tool. And there's a lot of stuff here. There's so much stuff. And there's this sidebar that has all this CSS information that we're not going to worry about right now. But you can sort of see the different parts of an HTML document. And I see there's something here called doc type. I see there's something here called head, which interestingly doesn't seem to show up at all. And then I see there's something here called body. And if I hover over that, I see that it looks like the entire document, right? And in fact, everything is included inside the body. Um, these divs, I'm not sure what they're here for. Amazon must be doing something special. And then if we kind of keep looking inside the body, we start to see different things. And in fact, if I click on a particular element is what it's called, it will show me where in the document this lives in the inspector. And to kind of make a diagram for this, let's start drawing some boxes and talking through them. So an HTML document is always going to start with that doc type that we saw. And that lets the browser know that this is an HTML file, and it lets it know what version of HTML it is, as in the past, there were other ways of declaring that. And let me kind of get rid of my dotted here. And then in an HTML document, we will always have what's called the body. And this is where most of our content lives. I'll talk about that head tag that we saw in just a minute. And if we look at how the Amazon page is ordered here, we see a layout that's pretty common. And let me go ahead and do a little annotating. We've got a nav bar along the top, basically. And once you all start browsing the internet and kind of looking at websites with this more trained eye, you'll see this everywhere, where the nav bar has things like a sort of a little hamburger menu here or key menu options. And in this case, it has a search bar. We see it has a carousel here. And then we sort of see these content areas, right? If I over here, I've got like one content box. I've got another content box. I've got another content box. And I've got another content box. And this is important because this is how you start to think about designing HTML pages and will help you understand as we get into HTML what all the different elements are for. And if we were to scroll all the way down, first of all, notice how even though, this doesn't line up exactly, but everything is actually ordered pretty well. Like if I had lined up my boxes better, all the content would sort of line up that way as well. And if we scroll all the way down here, we see a giant footer section, right? Where I could draw another box here if it wasn't going to kind of mess up my Zoom annotation. And so this idea of like boxes within boxes within boxes is really important. And we can draw this out here as well. And we'll talk in a little bit about the different HTML elements that are used, but excuse me, let me make sure I'm using TL draw for this. There we go. Right, our Amazon.com site, it has a nav bar. It has what's called a carousel, right, with those little really sort of links that we can click that have different content sections. we have these sort of like larger content sections over here where, you know, it had sort of an image and then some text. And let's again draw like a box, and we'll just call this, you know, title. And in fact, that's also a box. And then we have a footer at the bottom of our site where this is where sometimes like sort of legal information that needs to be displayed is displayed, or like maybe this is a link to the about page of the site or who created the website or stuff like that. And so if we look at this layout here, and we can see it here on the Amazon page, right? And we see it really everywhere we go. There's a couple different standard layouts for websites, but what we're seeing now is a pretty common one, right? And here we see there is a navbar section along the top. We have this sort of main content area divided into boxes. The boxes are arranged a little differently, but it's still boxes within boxes. And if I scroll all the way down, we've got our footer over here. So this idea of boxes within boxes and a sort of like very structured layout is really key. And if you start thinking about stuff this way, it will really help you design your web pages better and get a better handle on CSS as we get into things. So let's start building out some, excuse me, get a better handle on HTML. So let's start building out some HTML now that I've been talking about this a bit. And so let me go ahead and just create a new file. And the tradition is your main HTML file is always named index, as you see down here. And the reason is in the early days of the internet, the main page of a website was literally an index or a list of all the different pages that you could go to. These days, websites do so much more, but that tradition has stuck around. For instance, if we go to, let's go to Craigslist and see if they still kind of have things laid out this way. Because Craigslist has sort of deliberately kept a more old school approach that's just text. And Craigslist is a great example of sort of the original vision of the internet, where all the content is text-based. It's called static. Google Maps is dynamic. I can mouse around and I'm getting new data. This is static. I have to actually click on something for requests to a server to be sent. And it's simple and it loads fast. And even if we look at this, we see that there's a structure here, right? We see there's a sidebar and we see there's a main content section and then another smaller sidebar. And this is what's called a 3-column layout. And this is a really common layout as well. And we see even inside like these sections, we have a sort of navbar header area, and then we have these different boxes, right? And this is a great example of why the main page of a website traditionally is called index.html and still is, because this is literally an index or a link or a list of all the different pages that we could visit on Craigslist. And so I'm going to go ahead and create that file, and I'm going to go ahead and open it up. And I'm going to add a doc type flag. And for modern HTML documents, this is the doc type that we want to use. This is for HTML version 5. And the browser will find this tag to confirm that the content that we send is HTML and that it's a newer version of HTML as opposed to an older one. And after this, we're going to add an HTML element. And we're going to tell the browser what language we're using. And so we would obviously change this if we were working in other languages. And as we build this up, by the way, what we're going to see is that these different elements in the document actually form what's called a tree data structure. And if I was to write this out another way, we might see something like this. Right? Where this is box one, this is box two, this is box three, and this is box four. And then below here, we probably, let's just call this maybe like a content box. And each content box, or actually, let's call this a card. I think that's a better term. That's the term we'll often see. And a card has an image and a title. And then finally, we have our footer. And so what this sort of does is you can actually think of this as a tree data structure, which we'll learn about later. And I'm not going to draw out the whole tree because that would take a bit too long. But if we had the body, and then we had our nav bar, and then we had our carousel. And I'm just going to draw out a little bit of the carousel just so we can kind of see it. And these two are really, we call it siblings. They're at the same level of a tree. And this is very similar to, say, how our file system is organized with files and directories. In fact, it's called the file system tree, and you could make a similar diagram of that as well. And the reason that this HTML language is organized this way, where it sort of forms, can be used to form this tree data structure, this is how the browser sees HTML once it reads in the file. And so when I'm using that element inspector, or I'm using JavaScript or anything else, when I'm interacting with the document that's been created from that HTML text, this is what's running in the browser. And this is how the code that the browser is running and the code that I'm using, whether it's with JavaScript or anything else, can interact with this document. And this is actually called the document object model, or the DOM. And we'll learn more about this later. And I just want to check in to make sure that everyone kind of like sees the analogy of how I can imagine how this is organized as a tree. And to see if folks have any questions, because this is, though we're not going to get too deep into it today, this is a key concept. Okay, how are we doing?
The key concept is that HTML is being looked at by the browser as a tree or the DOM.
Yeah, good question. So if I go to, let's just use uh, the Wikipedia, let's stick with the Amazon example because it's a bit easier. Oh, forgive me. And let me open up our inspector. And after this, we'll pause and take a break. So I need to go all the way up here because there's a lot of things that the browser loads. Let's actually use the Wikipedia example because it's the Amazon one. Amazon just is doing so much advanced stuff with their website, it can be a little harder to navigate. And let's go ahead and refresh this page. So when my browser loads this page from the server sends back all of this HTML that I'm sort of scrolling through here. And this is all just text, right? It's like, when I have an HTML file, we have the .html file extension, but it's still just text. And the browser reads this the same way, like if I run a Python program on the command line, the Python interpreter reads my code. Well, the browser reads through all this HTML and it basically loads it into the browser's memory. And that's what we call the document or the document object model or the DOM, right? And then that's how, say, when the browser is like making a checkbox here or a label, or let's find when it's building this checkbox UI, the browser is really loading all of this into memory, and that's how it knows, all right, I want to render a checkbox here, and if someone clicks on this, then I better do something. So this is what's called the document or the document object model. And this is where that tree data structure comes in, because the HTML is just text, but then the browser reads it and builds this document object. Um, that I don't want to get too lost in that one because we're going to kind of dig into this more later, but I want to see if that helps a little bit with what's going on.
When you say browser, is it somewhat equivalent to saying client? Your client is reading it?
Yeah, good question. Um, yes, and I, and no. The browser is a client, right? Sometimes I often just you could refer to the computer as the client. Um, so the browser is a client here because it is the program making this request to the server with information coming back. But with HTML and the document object model, we're specifically talking about browsers because the browser is a program written specifically to work with HTML and render it and take that HTML file and actually turn it into checkboxes and input fields and display text and stuff.
Got it.
Yeah,
The browser's inside your client.
yeah, yeah. And a client can be anything. Like I could write a Python program that can make a request over the internet to another computer. Um, I can use command line programs to make requests over the internet. For instance, there's a command line program called curl. And that just made a request over the internet to the Google website. And this is really messy. But what this is the text of an HTML file. Like when you go to google.com in the browser, it the Google server sends back a bunch of HTML as text, and the browser renders that text into what we see here on the screen and builds that document object model. I can use
Got
a
it.
different client
There's
program.
so much other
Yeah,
stuff going on.
Okay, so
yeah,
I don't want to get into the weeds, but last question on this one. So curl isn't utilizing a DOM because it's not rendering it?
exactly.
Okay,
Exactly.
cool. All
All
right.
it's doing, yeah, all it's doing is grabbing information from here. It's saying google.com, send me back whatever
Fire.
you're supposed to send back by default. And by default, Google will send back its index.html page. And let's just refresh this and we can watch this happen. And somewhere in here, There we go. It's so a whole bunch of stuff is happening here because modern servers and browsers do a bunch of stuff to be efficient. But the guts of it is right here, where my browser is making requests to google.com. By default, if I just do it like this under the hood, what it's actually asking for is index.html. And that's just sort of a convention of the web. And so Google is sending back an HTML file. And the browser is reading this the same way the Python interpreter, when I run Python code, reads my Python code, and it's rendering it into the browser, right? It's rendering images, it's rendering text, it's rendering a search bar, and then it builds in sort of the running memory of the browser a document object model, or the DOM is what it's called. And that's how I can, when I'm using the inspector like this, I can interact with the DOM. And that's how, as a user, like if I type in cats, this isn't just like a static Word document or a PDF or something. I actually get some interactivity, and that's because of the document object model. And that's the browser's job, right? Curl is a really simple program on the command line whose job is just to fetch data. So I can give it a URL.
Just return the HTML stuff.
And this first part here is what we call the protocol, because for HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which isn't worth going into right now, but you all might have seen like an FTP server or something like that. So there's different ways of different protocols, so you can make different kinds of requests over the internet. And then this is the host name or the domain name, and we'll talk more about this in a bit. And then on that host or domain, I might have a specific page that I want to get. And so all that this curl program does is send a request over the internet for that information, and then it prints it out to the terminal. The browser makes that same request, but when it gets that information, it loads it into the browser's memory, it builds the DOM, and then that's how we see the website.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Great question. Let's pause here. Let's take 5. And when we come back, we'll get more hands-on, because we've covered a lot of ground here, right? And I want to make sure I don't get a little too tight on time. But we've covered a lot of the fundamentals of HTML and how the internet works. We've dug a bit into the HTML document structure, and we've seen how an HTML document is text, but it's structured text, right? And what the browser does is turn that text into what it calls the document object model, which under the hood is actually using a tree data structure. Though we don't have to worry too much about this, but it's very good to know because it helps us understand how this works. So when we come back after the break, we are going to dive into the anatomy of a URL. We're going to keep building out our HTML page, and we're going to use VS Code Live Server, and then we'll dive into a lot more of these elements. Thank you all very much, and I'll see you all in 5 minutes. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've started to dive into HTML and talk about how it has a structure to it that's sort of a tree structure, and how what the browser is doing is when it fetches an HTML file from the server, the browser is really kind of loading that HTML into memory, into the browser's memory, and constructing what we call the document or the document object model. And then that's how we're able to interact with the website. When I click on the search bar, how it can do stuff, and how I can click on things to change things, and the browser knows how to change stuff. We also talked a bit about sort of like fundamentals around how the internet works, where client programs, right? Which, as we learned, don't just have to be browsers. It could also be maybe it's a simpler command line program. And instead of a browser, maybe we're using the curl program on the command line, and we're making a request to the server to get data back. And let's in fact do this for Wikipedia just for fun, just so we can see it in action. I'm just going to go ahead and just going to grab this URL right here. I'm just going to do curl this, and we're going to put it, I'm just going to put it into a file named cats.html. And so here we're kind of seeing some information about this curl program making a request over the internet to this server, right? Specifically to look for this HTML page. And the server sends it back to us. And if I look at now, and I've told curl to pipe or put the output of that into a file, it's a little bit more advanced on the command line. And let's go ahead and let's format this document. And so we can see here, this is exactly the same HTML that my browser loads. My browser just knows what to do with it, right? And we see all this stuff here, and we finally start to get into the good parts. And these three dots here are just a browser extension, or excuse me, a VS Code extension I have that when you're working with lots of HTML makes it a little bit easier so it doesn't, excuse me, show you everything. Now let's actually start building out our own HTML page. And let's start digging more into HTML elements and tags and the HTML document structure. So I've created a doc type. I've added this HTML. So this is called an element. And over here, this is called an attribute. And note the format for an attribute is the name of the attribute on the left. And then on the right of the equal sign, we have the value of the attribute. And there's lots of good resources for HTML, but this Mozilla Developer Network, the MDN site, is sort of like the standard in that it has overall the highest quality. And if we go here and we find, in fact, the HTML element, we'll see a whole bunch of information of it. And it represents the root or the top level element of an HTML document. It's also called the root element. All other elements must be descendants of this element. And then we can see different attributes that we can give it. We don't need to give it a version. We can give it a language. And then we see an example here. Right? And note how we have what's called the opening of this element or tag. And then we have the closing. And the closing has this slash on it. So let me go ahead. Oh, good. I already have a closing element. Let's go ahead and let's now put in a head element. And this is different from like the header of a website. This is where you put in sort of like metadata about your web page. And so I might include things like using another element called meta for metadata. I might tell the browser some information about character encoding to use the UTF-8 character encoding scheme. And I might tell the browser some information about how to display this web page. And so this meta element, I'm using an attribute called name. And the meta element is a little different. And let me go ahead and just get rid of that double space that I don't want. And we'll learn more about what this is doing later. But in essence, I can tell the browser how much of the screen it should use when it's displaying a web page. So I'm saying it should use the whole size of the device, the whole width of whatever device the browser is running in. The device could be my iPhone, it could be an Android phone, it could be a laptop, it could be a tablet. And I'm saying the scale, right? Do I want to have it be like, do I want to display text twice as big as normal or sort of to the standard size? And then finally, I can add a title. And I'll show you all where this shows up in just a second. So this is sort of metadata about my HTML page. The good stuff goes here in the body. And note how all this is structured, where the head and the body are inside this HTML tag, right? And we call these child elements because when we talk about sort of tree data structures, we talk about parents and children or siblings, right? And these are on the same level. So these are siblings here within the head tag. And now in my body, let's use a header element that I can use to display text largely and so that when the browser reads my HTML, it knows this is a page header. And we'll just call it like this is the page title. And let's use what's called a paragraph tag. And we'll just say, let's in fact use a lorem. So what I did there is there's a VS Code extension called Emmet that has a lot of nice shortcuts. And a lorem ipsum is just, I have no idea what this says. It's Latin and it's just used to like take up space. So now that I have enough stuff here where we're actually going to be able to see something interesting on my HTML page, let's go ahead and use VS Code's live server to actually see it. And so over here in VS Code in the bottom right, there's this little go live button. And this uses the VS Code live server extension, which I believe we should have installed already. And this only works if you have an HTML page open. I'm not sure what it would do with a markdown file or a Python file. You really only should use it when you're looking at an HTML file in VS Code. And let's go ahead and click on go live. We see it says starting. We see it does a whole bunch of stuff and it opens up this web page. And so now I've got, this is the page title. I've got my information here and I've got this URL. And let's take a minute and let's just break this URL down. And let me go ahead and copy this. Actually, before we break down the URL, let's look at our HTML document, right? That was constructed from our page. We see here our header. By the way, this title, my title, we see this up here. So that's what this title does is it sets that little tab. And I can modify this. That's kind of one of the nice things about the inspector. Note now this title's been modified. But when I refresh this page, the browser is going to talk to the little server that VS Code has spun up and request the HTML page again. If we go all the way up, we see here index.html. And note that the title has changed back to my title because modifying stuff here doesn't modify the actual HTML file. This only kind of messes with what the browser is currently showing. So this is great for sort of debugging or prototyping, but when you need to make an actual change, you need to make it to the HTML file. And we see here in our body, our page title, our very first paragraph and the content of that paragraph, some extra stuff that VS Code Live Share added. And we see here the document object constructed from our HTML file. Now let's briefly talk about this URL. So anatomy of a URL. URL equals, I believe it's uniform resource locator. I want to say universal resource locator, but I'm almost positive that's wrong. And a URL has different parts. And let me just maneuver my text here a bit so I can add some zoom annotations to it. And that ought to do it. So a URL has different parts. We have this part here that's called the protocol. We have this part here that's called the host name. We have this part here that's called the port. And then we have this part here that's called the resource. So it looks like protocol, host name, port, resource. And there's different protocols for requesting information over the internet. The most common by far is HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Hypertext as in HTML, Hypertext Markup Language. The host name is basically the address of where the server lives on a network or on the internet. And sometimes we see a host name that looks, like Amazon.com. Well, under the hood, that gets turned into an IP address or Internet Protocol address that might look, I don't know, something like this. I'm just kind of making that up. A domain name server does this. So this is a host name or domain name, but under the hood, it's an IP address. And then finally, we have our port. And the port is basically the address inside the server. Because just like an apartment building can have a lot of individual apartments, a computer has many different ports running. And in fact, let's go to TLDraw for a sec here. And let's do a quick diagram. And let's say that this is, excuse me. Let's say that this is my computer. So on all of our computers, whether it's a phone, an Apple, a Mac, it doesn't matter. There are many different ports on the computer. And in fact, on my computer, it's running its own network. And it has a special IP address 127.00.1. You'll often see this called localhost, and that basically means, this machine. So because I can have the local network running on my computer, and then I might be connected to another network over the internet, or if I'm at work, maybe, there's the company's network, and then maybe that's connected to the internet. So there's many different networks that we could be interacting with. But every computer has its own little network, and that's one of the ways for different programs inside a computer to talk to each other. And let's see what port this was on again. Port 5500. So on my computer, when I spun up that live server program, it was running on port 5500. Over here on port 5432, the Postgres database engine we installed in InstallFest is running. And I know that because 5432 is the default port for Postgres. So there's literally thousands of these addresses. Again, just like an apartment building has many apartments with different addresses, we have tons of ports, probably 10,000 or more on the computer. By convention, the lower number of ports are sort of reserved and we don't touch them. But then once you get into like 5,000 and onwards, you can use them for different stuff. And then finally, we have the resource. right? And in this case, we're telling live server, hey, fetch this file named index.html. But I could have asked it to fetch a different HTML file, maybe cats.html. Maybe I had an image file. So a client can request lots of different HTML pages from a server, and it can request other things like image files that are not HTML pages. But again, to boil it down to the simplest scenario, I can edit an HTML page. I can go over here to the live server. I can, if I click, in fact, now it'll stop it. And in fact, while it's doing that, I'm going to take this moment to do a little screen rearranging now that we're going to get more into writing code. So just bear with me here for a sec. And what we're going to do is we're going to put this over here and put this over here. And the reason I want to do this is so that now when we start up our live server again, and let me find it in all the different kind of VS Code options here. And let's see, it seems to be hiding from me at the moment. But the other way to do this is if I open up, if I use Command Shift P to open up the command palette. And if I just start typing live server, then I should get my open live server option. So let's try, let's see if that's the one. So that's nice. It opens it up in there, but that's actually, I want to open it up in the browser. So let's do live server. Open with live server, and let's see if that does it. There we go. And now it's opened up in the browser again. And the reason that this VS Code extension is called live server is because I can go ahead and once I save my file, it will automatically update the HTML page for me. So that's not a normal browser behavior. That's live server working a little magic to send the new HTML to the browser. Rick, yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask the question. Maybe my setup's weird or something, but the I've had issues with that not working. Like if I'm got uh uh JavaScript going on in the footer and a bunch of pictures imported to the website, sometimes I have to refresh the browser even though I made changes and saved them. They don't work on the live server for some reason. Maybe it's an issue I got with my setup. I don't know.
Yeah, let's debug that one later. Sometimes with WSL2, there might be something a little funny going on. It should work pretty well most of the time. But folks, in general, if you need to, you can always hit refresh on the page, which is this little button here, and that should cause the page to refresh. All right, let's dive a bit more into different HTML tags so that we can start to see some of this stuff in action. So we've got a body. I have a paragraph tag. Let's in fact start organizing things a bit. And maybe what I want to do is I'm going to write a div here. I'm going to use the ID attribute, and let's just call this section 1. And let's put our paragraph tag inside here. Now, note that this div element isn't actually really doing anything. If I open up the inspector here, I see that the div is there. once we get to CSS, we'll see the value of organizing our HTML this way. But for now, I just kind of want to demonstrate it. And I might use a header2 tag and just add section 1 right there. And maybe I want to do something really similar. And this ID element, it needs to be unique. I'm not supposed to have two IDs with the same name. And in fact, we see this red squiggly here that says the ID value must be unique in the whole document. And let's put that div tag inside there, and let's put another header2 tag, and we'll say that this is section 2. And we can see that we're kind of starting to build stuff up here. And it might be nice to have a link. You know, we've been talking a lot about cats. So let's create a link here to this cats page. And I'm going to use, it's called the A tag. You'll also hear this called the href or hypertext reference tag. And what I do here is I have an attribute called href, and I give it the URL I want the link to go to. And then we can see here that inside the A tag, I have this text, and then that's what's displayed. If I click on that, I now have a link that takes me to Wikipedia cats. If I click back, it takes me back to my page. I could also write it this way. This text is inside the A tag, it's a child of it. While here for this href, that's an attribute. So the link also gets used, the href tag gets used for a couple different things. Really mainly for linking. There's a tag called link that we'll look at in just a little bit. Just to kind of keep rolling through this, let's say I want to maybe make some of my paragraph text bold. There's what's called a strong element. And now look how it's made that particular text bold. There's other ways to do this with CSS, and there's a way to customize this, but that's one way to add emphasis. Similarly, there's what's called an EM tag. EM is short for emphasis. And note how this text now is, if we go to, we can't quite see it, but just to highlight it here, is italicized by default. So there's ways to do this with CSS as well, but this is also useful because the HTML, the browser kind of knows our intent. There's what's called semantic meaning to these, that this text should be emphasized in some form. Let's go ahead and let's look at some form fields and some inputs and some attributes. So let me make just another div here, and we'll call it section 3. And we'll give it a header. And we'll call it section 3. And let's add another header, and we'll call it my form. So a form is like anything that you can interact with is usually called like a form element. And I think the one that we're most familiar with is called the input element. And just by itself, it's a text box, right? And I can type stuff in here, and here we see our input element. Now, note how this element's a little different in that I don't have a closing tag. I don't have close input. This is what's called sort of like a self-closing tag. You just add input and then you have the closing slash right there. There's a lot of different things you can put into an input element. You can put in one attribute is called placeholder. And now we see this placeholder text, type something here. You can even give it a default value. And now the input element has XYZ in it already. Again, the MDN page, I think, is the best source to go to really dig through to see all the different things you can do. For instance, you can give it a type. And let's look at that one in a sec. We'll do like a number type. And let's just go ahead and copy this and let's get rid of the value. And let's do type equals number. We'll talk in a little bit later about why these two input fields are next to each other. Note how with section 3 and my form, these take up the whole row, but with these inputs, it only takes up part of a row. This gets into a little bit of the CSS box model and display model, and the different ways that elements can be displayed. Some elements take up a whole row. Others are what's called inline, as we can see here, and it's usually sort of the input fields. And so now if I'm typing in here, you guys can't see, but I'm trying to type in letters and it won't let me. But if I type in a number, it works just fine. So it's pretty common to wrap different input properties in a form element. And when we deal with kind of like sending this data to the server, we'll start to see the value of this. I don't want to get too much into it now, but I do want to just show it. And I do want to show a couple other kinds of HTML elements that we can add. And so we can have a checkbox. And we can give it, excuse me, it's not, let's try placeholder. Excuse me. And I think maybe what I want is label. There we go. So there's a label element that I can use along with these input elements. And then there's everybody's kind of favorite input element, the button. And it's pretty small right now, but if I put in some text, excuse me, let me get this button right. Yeah, you know what? I apologize. You can do it this way, but the button element is actually the better way to do it. And this is how you comment things out in HTML, by the way, is with the sort of caret exclamation point and two dashes. This is what I was looking for. And you can add all sorts of interesting things to buttons. This is getting a little ahead of things, but I can add some JavaScript that will print a message when the button is clicked. And let's see. Yeah, so a couple of things are happening here. We can see hello flash really quick when I click on the submit button. But then it's a little hard to tell, but the page is actually refreshing when I click this submit button. And without getting too much into it, that's because of this form element. Because in the original days of the internet, this was the only way to send data to a server. So when you have like a button inside a form element like this, and you click on it, the form actually will send data to the server, and then the server refreshes the page automatically. So there's sort of some built-in behavior around HTML forms. Just to show a couple other input options real quick. There's a text area. And let's in fact put this maybe on a new line, and let's use a div to do this by putting this in here. So this is where the div can start to have value in terms of giving us structure. And then we could also have a drop down for what's called a select. And if I want to give my drop down different options, I can do it like this. And we see the different options, and I can give the different options different values. Right? Maybe I want the message to say one thing, but I want the value to be something else. So we have a lot of control over like the sort of basic interactivity. There's some other form inputs as well. I don't want to get kind of go through all of them. I just kind of want to do a brief survey right now. And let me just pause and check in and see if folks have any questions. Alex, yes, sir.
When you go to elements on your live server, how are you seeing the HTML? Because mine's all wonky. It's not showing me the HTML at all.
Let's take a look at that when we take a
Okay.
break or after the lesson, because I think I'd have to just see your setup.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Are you able to see like this HTML page here in the browser, or is that not working?
No, yeah, I can. I just can't see the HTML code in the terminal area.
Oh, do you have this elements tab here that's working?
Yeah, it's not, I wouldn't say it's working. It's showing me different info.
Okay. Yeah, we'll take a look at it later.
Okay.
Thank you for the heads up. Tom, yes, sir.
I know it can probably be edited with CSS, or maybe because it looks like the text area might be resizable, but is there any reason why the text area and the drop down don't line up?
Um, oh, this and this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a really good point. That I don't know why. That's just sort of, I think the weirdnesses of HTML and formatting. Um, And that's why, like, we're gonna get into it later, but that's why you kind of use divs all over the place to help kind of organize things. And that's where CSS starts to come into. What's undoubtedly happening is it's some subtle behavior of how the browser sort of renders this stuff. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, short answer is that's something that we would tackle with CSS. We can do it this way. You know what we can also do, there's something called a span. This probably won't solve the issue, but yeah, it doesn't solve the issue. So a span is often used to wrap an element sort of along a row, and then we could manipulate it. Rick, yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just gonna comment with Thomas. Yeah, it's something you do in like CSS, because with CSS you could align to right, align to center. You could set borders, all kinds of stuff to like make everything align up all nice and pretty.
Yeah, totally. And we're gonna look at CSS in a little bit.
Was
Um,
was I correct in stating that text area is resizable though? Like, cause it has that like little dashed corner.
oh yeah.
Okay, so that might be why it's not syncing up.
Yeah, it's the, CSS really covers all this stuff. Like just plain old HTML by itself, there's all these sort of little weird edge cases in terms of how it renders. Um, like we can kind of see here the line of this sort of overlaps with the line above it in a way almost that doesn't look great. So this kind of stuff, to be totally honest, it's not worth getting too lost in the sauce about because it's the problem that CSS was invented to solve. Yeah, but it is a good to develop that eye to see stuff like that for sure. All right, let me talk a little bit about lists and different ways of listing stuff. And then I do want to talk about, I think, images and links, and then I think we can take a break because we've covered a lot of ground here. We've added a form. Um, one element I do want to mention briefly is the break element to go back to our text here. If I insert a break, this is a line break. So note how in my HTML file, I haven't done like a new line or anything like that, but this break element will add a new line. And so I can format and manage text that way as well. Um, excuse me, I was just sort of looking over my notes here. So let's go ahead and let's add another section and we'll just call this section 4. And now let's talk about lists because these are super useful. So there's really kind of two kinds of lists. One is called an ordered list, and OL is short for ordered list. And so we have to create this parent ordered list element. And then we have to create what's called a list item element. And then we can have different things here. And note that the ordered list gives us numbering, and the browser also has some understanding that these are meant to be in order. What we almost always use, we rarely use an ordered list. We usually use an unordered list, which is UL, and then it's the same format. Where we see it show up with bullet points. And there's a lot of different ways to mess with the lists and the unordered lists. I don't want to get too lost in the sauce on those right now. But again, the MDN website really is your best friend, because there's a lot of things we can do. We can do nesting. We can put an unordered list inside another unordered list. Here we go. We do have this type attribute. That's a nice one. I think that can be fun. So let's maybe change this from a circle to a square. So it's definitely worth doing a little bit of reading up on the different elements as you are using them. And it's a little hard to see, but over here, rather than dots, these are now squares. And again, note how for these attributes, right, for this type attribute of this unordered list element, I've got the key, the name of the attribute, and then on the other side of the equal sign, I have the value, and I have to put it in single quotes. And if I want to experiment and mess around, the inspector tab is really good for this, because maybe I want to find my unordered list, and maybe I want to play around with the different attributes of it. And so maybe I want to change it from type square to disk, or I want to change it back to square. And remember, I can play around. It's totally fine. It doesn't actually modify my HTML file. And if I refresh the page, I get whatever I have here in my code back up. So we've talked about lists. We've talked about forms. We've talked about links. Let's talk about, or hrefs, let's talk about images, because this is a good one. And to do this, I am going to need to do a little bit of work to quickly grab an image. So I'm just going to go to this Wikipedia page. I'm going to open up an image in a new tab. And so what I have here now, let's see, this isn't quite the image file itself. Let's see if this does it. There we go. This is a really big image of a cat. This image file is actually pretty big. Wikipedia must be doing something to it to make it smaller. But if we look at this URL, we see that we've got the protocol over here, right? We've got the host name over here. And then we have a longer path to the actual resource, because Wikipedia must be organizing its images in different ways. But this URL now uniquely identifies on the internet the location of this cat image. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this, and I'm actually going to put this in the bottom of my file, or in the bottom of my HTML in section 4 here, because the image is so big, it's going to eat up everything else. And let's just add an H3, and we'll say cat pic, right? So our cat picture is going to go below here. And now I can use the image attribute and the image element, excuse me, and I can set this source attribute, and I just give it the URL of where that image is on the internet. And now my browser, when it gets to this line in the HTML, it actually makes another request over the internet to fetch that image file from Wikipedia's server. And we can kind of see that happening in the network tab here. Now there's a bunch of crap going on here, but here we have our HTML file is loaded from my VS Code Live server. It's running in my browser. So all this is still on my computer, and my browser is reading all the HTML. It's going from top to bottom. It's rendering it into the browser. It's building the document object model. Then all of a sudden it gets to line 62 in the HTML file, and it sees image, source, and this URL. And the browser says, oh, I need to send a request over the internet to this address for this resource. So now my browser is actually sending a request to this Wikipedia server, this upload.wikimedia.org, for this image asset. And the server actually sends back the file in binary format or some sort of format. very similar to binary. And then the browser actually renders the image, right? And so this image is way too huge. It's a little ridiculous, but this is how we can add images to our HTML files. And I think the last thing I want to show is, well, we'll talk about the link element when we get into CSS actually. So I think I'll just pause here because we've covered a lot of ground with HTML. There are a couple other things we didn't get into. There's sort of like some principles of design with HTML where you want to try and kind of organize things semantically. In fact, rather than using like div for all of these different sections here, I could have used what's called a section element and it would have done the same thing. And if we go to my code, it'll look exactly the same. And there's a couple of these. There's section, and you can kind of see it used here. There's also a nav element. And the thing about these is it doesn't actually change how anything is rendered, but it helps the browser know what each part of the page is for. And so when, say, like the Google web crawler is crawling the internet and looking at pages, these can be useful. Not everyone uses them. It's good to know, but it's not important. These didn't exist for a long time, and for a long time, everyone just used divs to organize things. But it is good to know that these are there. It is a good habit to start using them, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. Like for instance, I could wrap all of my code in a main element. And let's just put close main. And it doesn't actually change how any of this is formatted. But now, if I was using the section and the nav elements, then when like a web crawler is looking over my website, they might understand it a bit more easily. Though truthfully, web crawlers are so smart, they can figure it out anyway. But it is good to know that these things exist. I wouldn't worry too much about it right now because you still will see like divs used a lot, but it's good to know that these are there. All right, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. Let me just pause and see if folks have any questions, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll look at CSS. All right, let's break here, and then we'll come back and look at CSS.